We here at this church have for decades been part of larger movements within and through American Protestant Christianity that have had an open embrace for the new ways that we can discern God to be moving and speaking through our times, while staying rooted in what is life-giving from our living tradition. So we have been part of these ongoing church movements through the 19th century and 20th and now 21st century that have been responsive to the tremendous evolutions and revolutions in how humanity understands life on earth, understands our place in the cosmos, understands human history, human sexuality and gender, understands calls for justice, liberation, and equity. One personification of this is Reverend Antoinette Brown Blackwell, who was the first woman to be ordained since the early church. And as a Congregationalist minister in the 1800s, Reverend Blackwell was an abolitionist. She wrote for Frederick Douglass's paper. She was a leader in the suffrage and the women's rights movement. And she published entire books responding to the new theory of evolution, saying that Darwin's work was important but distorted by his male-centric way of doing science. And so she called for more women to become scientists, to be allowed to become leaders in any field. And at the same time, she defended religion as being rational and compatible with the discoveries of science. So very much engaged in a responsive way to all of the evolutions and revolutions in human understanding at her time. In the United Church of Christ, we say God is still speaking. And we believe it is a matter of faith to be listening for this still speaking God and to be responsive to what is new about how the divine is on the move. So we belong to a creative and living tradition. We belong to a fiercely independent-minded tradition, for better and for worse. So what does it mean that we are a congregational church? Why do we have such a long and kind of unwieldy name? First Congregational United Church of Christ of Walla Walla. So the congregational part comes from a movement centuries ago in England and the U.S. and then elsewhere that said that individual congregations should be in charge of their own affairs. And this movement was pushing back against the abuses of bishops who were pawning people around, especially when those bishops were themselves being pawned around by kings and queens, or they were doing the pawning of the kings and the queens. So this is guaranteed to produce abuses of power. That's guaranteed to trample over the humble, heart-changing gospel of Jesus. And so the Congregationalists, for their part, responded by taking the focus away from church hierarchy and putting it on local congregations, as well as on individuals and our freedom of conscience before God in how we work out our own soul salvation. So this immediate connection between the believer and the community of believers and God, not a connection that has intermediaries of church hierarchy. Congregationalists then developed looser organizations of churches, connected through bonds of covenant, but where no one entity of the church could tell anyone else what to do or how to be, or even, as time went on, what to believe. So one of the consequences of this has been that more free-thinking movements that crop up within Christian communities don't get stamped out by a larger church hierarchy. And so as a result, our churches were the first to ordain women, the first to ordain openly gay clergy and trans clergy, first to bless same-sex marriages. Now, one of the drawbacks of this way of organizing churches is that individual congregations can kind of drift away from each other and become isolated and things then can get fuzzy. So we have regional and national organizations that have important roles, but it's always up to the local church to be engaged in what degree they want to be engaged with that larger sense of shared identity. And in the life of our local church here, the First Congregational Church of Walla Walla, in its 155 years of existence, there seems to have been different seasons where there have been stronger or weaker connections between the local church and the larger bodies of our denomination. And the reason why I'm making this the subject of the sermon this Sunday, and continuing next Sunday as well, is that in the season of life we currently are in as a local church, we have been, we are, and I believe we will continue to be really benefiting from our relationship with the larger denomination and with the movement of the Spirit that has been going on through the United Church of Christ. And so we will benefit from deepening that sense of connection and that identity and being really clear and true about who it is that we are, why we are here, who our allies and fellow workers are, and how God is at work through us and through the larger movement that we are but one expression of. So let me share then some about this United Church of Christ piece. What does that mean? So the United Church of Christ was formed in 1954 by the union of 4 different American Protestant denominations with European roots. And one of the 4 were the Congregationalists. And so that's why this church has such an elaborate name. First Congregational Church of Walla Walla, United Church of Christ, or sometimes we say First Congregational United Church of Christ of Walla Walla. So it's a congregational church. It was the first in town. There was a second for a while, which then dissolved into this church, and so we remain the first. Congratulations. And then when the United Church of Christ formed in the 1950s, the people of this church got together and discussed the matter and voted to join the UCC. No one was forcing anybody to do anything there. And one of the things that these 4 streams that joined into the UCC had in common was this Congregationalist value that local churches should be free from top-down power. But the other main reason for this union was the desire for union, sharing the value of having a big tent faith, going against the stream of always having schisms and break-offs and blowout, knockdown, takedown battles, and instead having an ecumenical scope of things, a spirit of toleration that comes then from the knowledge that in the full scope of divine truth, we're all cut from the same cloth. And this is, I think, an important reason why here at our church we really have had this living tradition of embracing anyone and everyone who finds safe sanctuary here. And I kind of like the joke that we are the recovery church. I mean, we host a lot of addiction recovery groups, but then as well as a worshiping community, we have recovering Adventists and recovering evangelicals and recovering Catholics, and we have recovering atheists, and Congregationalists themselves are recovering Puritans. I mean, that's a whole other story. It isn't, it isn't always just pure and progressive. Anyhow, for all these reasons, this is why it's been a key value in the UCC from the start. In essentials, unity. In non-essentials, diversity. In all things, charity. In essentials, unity. In non-essentials, diversity. And in all things, charity. And I hope that as we go from one UCC church to the next across this country, you'd find quite a spirit of charity for this diversity, and you will find quite a lot of diversity among the local congregations throughout the United States and North America. Quite a lot of theological diversity, quite a lot of kind of diversity in political inclinations, racial and ethnic diversity as well. But what would be the unity that you'd find? What are the essentials then? So let me share with you the purpose statement of the United Church of Christ, which riffs from the Gospel of Matthew. So the national body of the United Church of Christ has set this as their purpose: to love God with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength, to love our neighbor as ourselves. And then the vision statement of the United Church of Christ nationally is united in Christ's love, a just world for all. United in Christ's love, a just world for all. That is our vision. And then the mission statement of the United Church of Christ: united in spirit and inspired by God's grace, we welcome all, love all, and seek justice for all. So this is our way of distilling down the core of what we believe it means to be followers of Jesus. And you'll recognize echoes from parts of the Bible that themselves distilled down the essence of faith. So in the Gospel of Matthew, someone came up to Jesus and asked him to distill it down, basically. "Teacher, which precept in the law is the greatest?" And Jesus said, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest and the first precept. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself." These two precepts hang all the law and the prophets. That's the essence. And then you'll also recognize quite an emphasis on doing justice within the United Church of Christ, as well as living by grace. And this echoes the prophet Micah, who also distilled things down. God has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does God require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God? So these words are simple enough and deep enough and true enough and open enough, I believe, to guide us and connect us as we live creatively and earnestly as a church community, as a school of love, within this wider movement that we call the United Church of Christ. And for all of that, I give thanks to God.